Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming here. Apparently the title of this discussion has changed several times, but the one that I'm going with today, and I've discussed with the panelists, is Iraq, the US withdrawal, and everything after. And hopefully we'll be able to take in a broad sweep of what is exactly going on in Iraq at the moment, lessons that have been learned from things that have happened before, and where we might be going into the future, given that the Iraq war has now become the forgotten war, whereas the Afghan war previously was the forgotten war, while we concentrated on the post-invasion process through 2003 until about 2008. On my left is Jim Frederick. He is a contributing editor at Time magazine and an author, most recently of a book called Black Hearts, One Platoon's Descent into Madness. Here's the book. I'm sure he has some on sale, and he will certainly like to sign your copy. It is an extraordinary book. It has detail in it about a really heinous crime that was carried out, a war crime, by a platoon of soldiers in what was called the Triangle of Death, south of Baghdad, in the Yusufia area. It was a breakdown of discipline amongst the troops, and it was at a time of extreme stress that they went off and committed a crime. And I will read an extract from that book before Jim starts his spiel just now. One of the things that really struck me about his book is the amazing recreation of the reported speech in Black Hearts, a seamless screenplay redolent of the US military's pithy communications, and you'll get a sense of that from the extract. Previously, he was senior editor at Time magazine in London, and before that he was magazine's Tokyo bureau chief. He also co-authored another book with former Army Sergeant Charles Robert Jenkins, an extraordinary piece of work about a man who was called the Reluctant Communist, my desertion, court-martial, and 40-year imprisonment in North Korea. It was about well, I'm sure that Jim will tell you, but about a US serviceman who went over to North Korea during the Korean War. Next to Jim is John Sloboda, who is a professor of psychology and honorary research fellow in the School of Politics, International Relations and the Environment at Keele University. Through his research into the changing nature of the British anti-war movement and his involvement in the NGO, the Oxford Research Group, John has become somewhat of an expert in non-violent approaches to conflict resolution and national and international security issues. He was also the co-founder of an extraordinarily useful and rather shocking website called the Iraq Body Count Project, which aimed to shine an objective and verified light on the shocking estimates of Iraqi civilian casualties when the authorities were taking no notice of how many people were being killed. On my right is Haifa Zangana, who is an Iraqi novelist and artist. She is most notably known for her books, Woman on a Journey, Between Baghdad and London, City of Widows, Iraqi Women of an Account of War and Resistance, and coming out in a couple of weeks' time, The Torturer in the Mirror. So an accomplished writer, and she grew up in Baghdad. She was imprisoned by Saddam Hussein in the 70s, by the Baathists rather, in the 70s. And after she had managed to escape execution, she finished her studies in Iraq before moving through Syria and Lebanon to settle in London in '76. She writes for The Guardian and for Red Pepper, which you might be aware of, described as a magazine of political rebellion and dissent, influenced by socialism, feminism, and environmental politics. And Haifa also writes for the Arabic newspapers Al-Ahram and for Al-Quds. And last but not least is Sir Hilary Synnott, former British diplomat. He was the regional coordinator of the Coalition Provisional Authority in southern Iraq from 2003 to 2004, which was a pivotal time when the Brits were in charge in southern Iraq, and a lot of deals were done, it would appear, but I'm sure that Hilary will tell us about that. He retired from the diplomatic service in 2005 and published a book about his time in Basra called Bad Days in Basra. His diplomatic posts prior to that included Paris, Bonn, Amman in Jordan. He was promoted to the Deputy High Commissioner in India and was later the High Commissioner in Pakistan, which is a post that puts him in a position to know a lot about what is going on in that part of the world at the moment. He annoyed the British military when he was in Iraq immensely by insisting that they always remembered that he had been a submariner in the forces. So, if we move on from there, what we will do, the structure of the evening is we'll have a sort of 5 or 6 minute perambulation by each of the panelists, and then we will go into a discussion between them, and after that we will pick up on any questions from the audience. I'm going to read you a very, very shocking extract from Black Hearts. The F word features in this, so forgive me for that. The author here was copying the pithy communications of the way that the American military speak. So be aware that this is not for children. At around noon, with a new wave of boredom taking hold, the three of them, along with Private First Class Jesse Spielman, sat down outside with a cardboard box as a table to play some rounds of Uno. They drank Iraqi whiskey. The men, as they played, got drunker and drunker. Cortez later rated their level of intoxication as 6 or 7 on a scale of 10. During one of the rounds, Cortez popped up and said, "Fuck it, we're going to go and do this thing." He outlined the mission and he divvied up the duty assignments like a legit patrol. He and Barker would take the girl, Green would kill the rest of the family, Spielman would pull guard, and Howard would stay back and man the radio. He told everyone to get their rifles and get ready to head out. Green grabbed a shotgun. Cortez and Barker snagged M4 rifles. Spielman picked up an M14, a larger, heavier rifle than the M4, frequently used as a longer-range weapon. Cortez briefed Howard. Cortez told him they knew about an Iraqi girl who lived near here, and they were going to go out and fuck her. To Howard, it was the most insane thing he'd ever heard. He did not believe them, but he also could not believe that they were actually going to leaving for somewhere, leaving him and Scheller alone. Cortez gave him the radio and told him to call if there were any patrols or Humvees coming through. The men, armed and disguised, headed out the back of the TCP. Jim.
Thanks. Thanks for that very kind introduction, and it is a great, great honor to be here, and excuse me, thank you very much for having me. Because Black Hearts is new in the UK, it came out in March in the States, I thought I'd just talk a little bit about it and how it came about. And that is, yeah, that's a particularly shocking excerpt from the book. Black Hearts is the culmination of 3 years of research and my attempt to reconstruct the deployment of 1st Platoon Bravo Company of a brigade known as the Black Heart Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division to a region south of Baghdad in 2005 and 2006 called the Triangle of Death, which I think it's arguably the most dangerous part of Iraq at its most dangerous moment when the war was at its darkest for U.S. and coalition forces. This deployment came to my notice because in July 2006 there was 2 rapid-fire news reports within a couple weeks of each other. The first one, 3 troopers had been, U.S. paratroopers, they're not actually paratroopers, they're air assault soldiers, 101st Airborne soldiers had been taken hostage, abducted by insurgents. 1 was killed on the scene, and 2 were missing for in excess of 72 hours. It prompted the largest manhunt in the war's history. 8,000 soldiers flooded that region looking for these soldiers within 72 hours. They were found 72 hours later, beheaded, mutilated, booby-trapped with IEDs. That, you know, was a horrible and gut-wrenching story. At the time, I was Tokyo bureau chief of Time magazine. I'd never been to Iraq. I had no more interest in the Iraq story than a news reader, a news consumer. I was not a journalist. I was not a war correspondent. No more than 2 weeks after that, there was another news report that came out that 4 U.S. soldiers had been accused of raping a 14-year-old Iraqi girl, killing her, her parents, and her 6-year-old sister. It took a couple more weeks and a phone call from a source of mine to realize that these 7 soldiers, the 4 accused and the 3 who were dead, were from the same platoon. An infantry platoon in the United States is about 35 people, 35 men. I mean, they're men. 35 men. So seven men out of 35 were involved with 2 of the most notorious events that had happened in the war to that date. And that got me thinking that something must be going on with 1st Platoon, Bravo Company. And so I started researching what happened. I followed the trials of the 4 who were accused. They were, not to give anything away, they were all found guilty and they're all doing time in excess of 90 years. I called up the other soldiers from the rest of 1st Platoon and Bravo Company. And what started as, I guess a true crime story, I wanted to know how the unthinkable happened. How does something like that actually come to pass? So how does a conversation, I mean, I didn't know what the conversations were yet, but how do those conversations happen? And the more I researched the story, the more I determined that there was way more to the narrative than the U.S. Army's overarching story, which was that, oh, these were 4 bad apples, and criminals exist in every culture and every subculture. Rapists and murderers exist in society, and we just couldn't have seen this happen. And in fact, 1st Platoon, within 5 or 6 months of their deployment, was so degraded and was throwing off so many red flags that there was something terribly wrong in 1st Platoon, that it indicated to me that there was a very serious breakdown in leadership and war fighting and what was happening in the Triangle of Death at that time that might be useful in terms of leadership lessons and strategy of the war lessons. Bravo Company, which 1st Platoon was a part of, was about 135 men. Over the course of their deployment, they lost 51 out of their 135 men to either death or injury that were serious enough to be evacuated out of theater. The battalion, which occupied 330 square miles, the vernaculars got blown up by or found 900 IEDs. And so in a deployment that's about, that's 3 a day, every day. And they were in some form of combat, small arms fire, mortar fire, every other day. But the deeper I got into the story, the more I came to understand that 1st Platoon and Bravo Company, the rest of the men, they were so honest and insightful in their interviews that they experienced the same deprivations, the same loss, the same hatred that the 4 men of 1st Platoon who committed the crime did. That I became much more focused on the rest of the platoon, and it became a story of, well, why do some men, and they are all men, this is an infantry company, why do some men give in to the ultimate inhumanity of warfare and defile the innocent and rape the defenseless and kill the old and the infirm and the young, and other men don't, who experience the exact same thing? So the story, as intended, it became a story of leadership and morality and character and integrity in combat as seen through the lens of 1 platoon and 1 company over the span of their entire deployment. And to move on to the second part of my opening remarks, the troubles and the travails and the problems that 1st Platoon and Bravo Company experienced is a direct link between the strategic failures of the war in those early years. We always heard about, well, there weren't enough boots on the ground. Well, what does not enough boots on the ground mean? Well, not enough boots on the ground mean that a company is trying to hold down a battalion-sized area of operations. And so the story of Black Hearts is the tactical consequences of a failed strategy filter all the way down through the individual foot soldier, and of course, obviously, I guess, by connection, Iraqi society, because they're impaired massively negatively, is probably the understatement of the evening. And immediately after this round of deployments is when counterinsurgency theory in practice, as envisioned by General Petraeus and his whole team, started to come into practice. And there's multiform, many reasons why there was a dramatic decrease in violence in 2007 and 2008. And it is a ridiculous gloss to say that it's all because of the surge and it's all because of 30,000 extra troops. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. The Sunni Awakening Councils was one. Muqtada al-Sadr's removal from national politics for a little while was another. I mean, that's some of the stuff we'll talk about. But it was successful, and we are now at the point where the United States is pulling out and combat operations are ending this month with an eye towards successfully retrieving all troops by the end of next year. And if one of the questions asked of me is what is the American perspective on the pullout, you're exactly right. It is the forgotten war. And unless there's a dramatic increase in violence, I don't think that the American public is going to take much notice of Iraq from here on out. I wouldn't say that the American society thinks that the state in Iraq is a victory, but it is perceived to be the least bad option. And if you look back to 2005 and 2006, it could have ended much worse than it is. And Iraq has much hard work ahead of it, and a lot of that work is going to be done by Iraqis, and it's not going to be done by Americans. And I would say that, in conclusion, the focus among American people right now is Afghanistan is darn near an obsession, and the Iraq War is, whether true or not, is virtually considered to have been concluded, and concluded in a way that it might have not been a victory, but it's not an unmitigated defeat.
Thanks very much. So we move on to John, and the link through to John would be the Iraq body count. Essentially, what we've been talking about in the effects of incidents like the Black Hearts, the Abu Ghraib, where people weren't necessarily killed, but the unbelievable pictures of torture that came out, and the huge number of people that were killed, both within the fighting between Iraqi sects or groupings and by the coalition in its war fighting in trying to control that, left a huge number of dead people. Now, one of the reasons that we went into, or that the coalition went into Iraq in the first place, was because, as Mr. Blair told us frequently, Saddam Hussein was killing lots of people, and they would always go back to Halabja and all those kind of reasons for wanting to go in and sort him out. The Iraq body count obviously has countered that cost, and so I hand over to John to take it forward from there.
The day on which the 4 members of the Janabi family were killed, and which forms the heart of Jim's book, was March the 12th, 2006. The public record lists another 109 Iraqi civilians killed that day in the violence that has engulfed Iraq ever since the invasion of March 2003. Therefore, on that one day alone, more Iraqis were violently killed, nearly twice as many as died in the London 7/7 bombings. And every day in Iraq has been a 7/7 or worse for years on end. And each one of those lives, brutally cut short, was a human tragedy. Each death has shattered a family whose wounds will be felt for generations to come. And there is a story that needs to be told about each of these deaths before there can be any form of closure or moving on. Now, of course, America and Britain need to come to terms with the enormity of what they unleashed on Iraq. And of course, Jim is right to say that you cannot understand why Stephen Green and his colleagues did what they did without understanding the entire context in which young American men found themselves in impossibly challenging circumstances. And he is absolutely right to show that the responsibility for what happened travels right up the chain of command and implicates not only military but political leaders. But actually, We will never fully understand this war or learn the lessons we need to learn from it when the primary narratives in circulation are those of Americans and other non-Iraqis, be they soldiers, politicians, or writers. Such narratives are inevitably incomplete and one-sided. But more than that, they frame the whole debate, I have to say, in a somewhat narcissistic context. The war becomes about us, whether we choose to use the war for self-justification or self-flagellation. But this war is not an American tragedy or a British tragedy, it is an Iraqi tragedy. And it saddens me, and it limits this book in ways which, it's not Jim's fault, that there is so little sense of a richness of the picture of the Iraqis involved and how they were affected by the events he describes. And it saddens me that there are so few books available which tell the story of Iraq through the eyes of Iraqis who have lived through this time of entirely human-caused disaster and heartbreak. Now, the same deficiencies characterize the British government's approach to casualties. Back in 2004, 53 former British diplomats wrote an open letter to Prime Minister Tony Blair, lambasting his post-invasion policy in Iraq. And their strongest censure was reserved for the failure of the British government to track civilian casualties in Iraq, a failure that these 53 eminent men called a disgrace. And the Frontline Club, back in 2004, hosted an event in this very room to discuss that letter, and I happened to be present at that discussion. And I have to report that 6 years on, there has been absolutely no progress on this matter whatsoever. The British government has told us no more today than we knew in 2004. And when the Chilcot Iraq inquiry was announced, we at Iraq Body Count saw this as an important opportunity to hold the British government to account on this issue. And we immediately wrote to Sir John Chilcot, strongly advocating that he make Iraqi casualties a central focus of the inquiry. Now, up till today, we have not put our correspondence with the inquiry into the public domain, but it's now in the public interest that we do so, and we will shortly post the full correspondence with Chilcot on our website. In November 2009, he wrote to us and said, the inquiry team were already aware of the work of Iraq Body Count, and we have studied some of the information produced by you. The inquiry's terms of reference are broad and require us to focus on the lessons that can be learned from the UK's involvement in Iraq during 2001 to 9. The information you have collated will be very useful to help us in this task. But despite this statement, the amount of attention actually paid to Iraqi casualties by the inquiry has been pitiful. Most of the attention has been on the interplay between political and military actors here and in the USA. Only once was there a brief exchange about casualties where Adam Ingram, former defence spokesperson, was being questioned by Roderick Lyne. Ingram justified government silence thus, and I'm quoting now from the public transcripts of the inquiry, I don't think we were saying at any point that there weren't mass casualties taking place. What we were not doing was putting a precise or approximate figure on that. And a little later on in this interchange, which lasted about 3 minutes, Lyne said, you say it wasn't the MOD's job. Should it have been someone else's job to deal with this? And Ingram responded, unquestionably. And then he talked about, should DFID have done it? Should the FCO have done it? Should the UN have done it? But it certainly was not the job of the MOD or the Army. And then the conversation flowed on to other matters. And that's the total sum of attention to Iraqi casualties in the inquiry, which went on for nearly a year. 3 minutes. Now, Ingram may have thought that casualty recording was not a priority for our armed forces, but senior military voices are now thinking otherwise. In a few days' time, a paper which will be co-authored by us and a senior serving British Army officer will appear in the journal, the British Army Review. And when published, this paper will be available on the Oxford Research Group website. In this paper, it's argued that not only is the recording and publishing of casualty figures technically feasible for the armed forces, but it is actually in their interests and in the interests of the politicians that they serve to do so. In fact, I and my colleagues believe that every civilian victim of this war and all wars, wherever they are in the world, deserve to be properly memorialized. And we are already working with others who share our vision to develop and promote this wider concept as a realistic proposal for government and public action in Britain and elsewhere in the world.
Thank you, John. Just picking up off of that, just to clarify that the figures that are on your count are not just people who were killed by the coalition forces, but also came from the internecine fighting that took place.
Absolutely. The website documents civilian deaths killed by violence in Iraq by coalition forces, unknown actors, insurgents, anybody who was killed in the conflict.
Right. So, taking it on to Haifa. Haifa, one of the things that you will find if you Google Haifa is that she has been strident about the what she sees as an imposed definition on Iraqi society, possibly post the invasion, which is that prior to the invasion we never called ourselves Sunnis or Shia. We didn't matter what sect or religion you came from. We were all Iraqis. And she has written extensively about that and been interviewed on this subject. A lot of the people who show up in the body count were actually killed by Iraqis. Actors unknown, but certainly not by coalition forces. The coalition forces were unable to control the slaughter as it went forward. And so I've asked Haifa to talk to that definition of, and the imposition of the definition of Sunni Shia sects, whether you were Christian, Armenian, or whomever.
Well, I'll just carry on from Abir's rape and killing, and the killing of her family as well, because I know some members personally of her family, Al-Janabi family in Mahmoudiyya and Yusufiyya. I just want to tell you that among Iraqi women, there is a suggestion, and we've been working on for a couple of years now, that we have to have a memory, a day in the year, the day she was killed, that we call the Iraqi Women Day, like International Women's Day. So just to prove that the memory is not going to be erased. It will be associated for many years to come, even if there is a true withdrawal of the American troops in Iraq. I'm talking about this because this is something to do about the relationship between Iraqi, American, and British people in the future. And what do we do to bridge this huge gap of notorious actions taking place in Iraq? The other thing I would like to mention that after the death, the killing of Abir, and this is an answer about the Sunni, Shiite, and all these divisions among Iraqis. There was a campaign by the Iraqi resistance, which lasted for 6 months, of attacks on the US troops, and that was called Nusrat al-Mu'minat, that is in support of the faithful, and that is to take revenge for the killing of Abir al-Janabi, her little sister, 6 years old, and her parents. This is another indication, and that group of people who led this campaign for 6 months was not Sunni. It was not just Sunni, but it was representative of the whole Iraqi society. There were Sunni, Shiite, Christians among them, and that is documented. So this could be maybe give you an indication of this divisions being created, and I insist being created or nurtured by the occupation. It's very useful. It's been very useful. And instead of saying there is occupation, instead of saying the occupation targeting Iraqis, instead of blaming it on the use of drones, continuously attacking families and erasing cities like in Fallujah, it is useful to blame it on the insurgency. It's useful to listen to the military spokesman immediately without doing any investigation or looking into the matter, to blame it on the terrorist also without mentioning. And I think in one of the paragraphs that Jim mentioned in the book, that what to do, I mean, apparently the American troops were on Bravo. group being like in a dilemma, thinking how can we cope with this passive and sometimes positive support of Iraqi people to the insurgency. I mean, at least there is this kind. So insurgency or resistance is there, and it is really about all Iraqi people resisting the occupation itself. The other point is about last year on the 19th of June, 13 groups of the Iraqi resistance got together and they elected a speaker or someone who is willing to represent them and also to negotiate in the future when there'll be negotiation between the occupation and the Iraqi people. This is something you don't read in the newspapers. You don't, nobody talk about, they don't mention the word resistance. And this is when it's happened immediately after the occupation. Iraqis have been sidelined. Iraqi people has been sidelined. And all what we hear about is military spokesman, the CPA, or British spokesman, and all the stuff. But none of the Iraqi. Actually, I mean, the blackout on Iraqi voice has been from the beginning. It's nothing new now. When they say there is a fatigue about Iraqi issue, and that really contradictory with so many places I go to and I speak to people, and there is interest from the British people. There is, I've been on tour twice in America, and there is an interest by the American people to listen and to hear. They're not available. There is hardly any mention of Iraq now. It's the media, whether it's selective, whether it's their control. I don't want to go into that, but there is kind of a decision that push it aside. We don't want to know about it. It is part of the establishment or non-establishment. But what I'm concerned about really, and I'm worried about, and probably I represent the old generation of Iraqis. That's why I keep warning people. Look, they don't talk, even they don't want to learn English anymore. At my time, we were keen to read literature, to go to plays in English language. I used to go to the British Council like twice weekly, struggling in order to learn English or to read any magazine. Now they don't want to speak the language. They don't want to hear about it. Young people don't want to hear about pop music anymore, which they used to love, we used to love, and all that. So this is the link with the people we are worried about. It's not mentioned or anything. And that will not happen, really. Will not happen unless people in America and people in Britain, in the UK, take things in their hands and deal with the issue of democracy. It is democracy in this country, and we used to look up on that. We wanted democracy. Now I cannot really mention the word democracy in Iraq, which is very sad and terrible, and give you an indication of what's going to happen in the future. We're going to have more terrorists if there are terrorists now. And this is frightening because moderate people, sensible people are disappearing. They're not there anymore. Either they've been killed or left, assassinated. Academics no more there. Consultants no more there. Intellectuals disappear. 70% of our intellectuals outside the country. So this is what's left of Iraq, a complete destruction, cultural destruction, a human infrastructure. That is what's left. And we have to think of what we do rather than wait for the administrations or the British government, nitty-gritty, splitting hairs about the thinking, like spending years discussing what's the meaning of torture while they're torturing people. Is it waterboarding or what? What is torture? That's clear for any person in the streets. Anyway, we will have more to talk about. Thank you.
So moving on from there, one of the things about the killings and also the situation that Iraq finds itself in now is the influence of Iran in Iraq. And that was one of the things that was starting to manifest itself at the time that Sir Hilary was running southern Iraq for the CPA. And he said to me that he would like to talk about the lessons that are learned from there and the things that have come out of that particular period. So I'll hand over to him on that, and then we'll start moving on to where we are in Iraq today and where it might be going.
Thanks, Tim. Well, the thing about being the last speaker after these three extremely powerful presentations is that actually there's so many things on which one would like to comment on. I mean, powerful, important, true, and very moving. And if, notwithstanding your guidance,
sure.
If I can just start by commenting on Jim's book, which I think is a very chilling book, quite apart from being grippingly written. It's a very important book because it tells you about the sort of contrast between an ethos, a very important ethos within the military of the United States and within Britain, which is in 21st century very high standards within our social community, and in practice aberrations which occur. And reading his book, and I've only had time to read a third of it, but it reminded me of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And I think required reading for, I can only speak for the British, but for British officers and administrators. On the Iran point, and then I'll come on to lessons learned. Well, I suppose what one can say about Iran is that, of course, first of all, Iran is a next-door neighbor of Iraq. Secondly, it regards the United States as an existential enemy. So actually, the Iranian position is a bit of a dilemma. On the one hand, it would like to see America embarrassed and defeated in Iraq. On the other hand, it doesn't have an interest in having complete chaos on its western border. So there is a line to be drawn there. And I think historically, if you see what the Iranians have been doing between 2003 onwards, has been quite a finely graded policy, which includes moderating Muqtada al-Sadr at a time when he was a real powerful threat to American interests. It was clear that actually Iran had what can only be described as a beneficial interest. Now, that isn't part of a lot of the Western narrative, but I think it's probably to a great extent true. I mean, I have to say that in my time in Iraq, 2003, 2004, there was a lot of stuff going around about what Iraq was doing, but from my position on the ground, which didn't actually have access to intelligence, I was not able to corroborate that. All I could say was that there were very close tribal links between Iraqis in the southeast and Iranians across the border. And there were also links of warlike links, because the Iraqis, the Shia in the southeast had fought with Iranians against Saddam. So they had that common interest. So not surprisingly, there should be a considerable Iranian influence. But let me turn to my hobby horse, really, which is lessons to be learnt. And I think Jim's book is perhaps indirectly, perhaps directly, a great contribution to this. I mean, there are lots of books which produce lessons, which have, in a way, been learnt, in the sense that they are in the public domain. What I'm much more concerned about is whether our governments are putting them into practice. And I think, you know, after every conflict, we see these lists of lessons that should be learned. Very wise, very good, very accurate. But as a former apparatchik, I would say that one sees less evidence of any real effort being taken to turn this into practice. And I think, you know, that there are lots of lessons to be learnt. I won't go through them all, but if I can just touch on military lessons to be learned and civilian lessons to be learned. On the first, military lessons to be learned, I'm not a military man. I mean, I was a submariner, but that gives me absolutely no qualification to talk about the British Army, and it's really only the British Army that, you know, I'm in any position to comment on. But a lot of studies are being conducted now by the British Army, some of which I've been involved in. I just wonder whether the narratives about performance in Iraq, performance in Afghanistan, may be possibly being dominated a bit too much by senior officers, 1-, 2-star level, brigadier level, brigade commanders, major generals and above. I have found, and I've done quite a bit of this, talking to colonels and and majors and captains and lieutenants. I've had less exposure since I've left Iraq to ordinary private soldiers, which Jim describes fluently in his book. I just, there is another narrative out there. And I just hope that, I'm not talking here about Chilcot, but when we're talking about operational lessons to be learned, that the evidence and the impressions of junior officers is taken into sufficient account. Obviously, there is a conflict, an understandable conflict, between pointing out where things went wrong and the really crucial importance of maintaining the morale, prestige, and reputation of a regiment. Because actually, soldiers often fight for each other rather than, certainly not the government, perhaps the Queen in the sense of the nation, but actually they fight for each other, and that includes their officers. The second point is the importance of the officer corps. And I think Jim's book illustrates what happens when there can be a breakdown between the private soldier, many of whom he describes come from very disturbed and broken backgrounds, deeply broken backgrounds, who look to others for leadership, sometimes because they need to be led actively to prevent them getting into serious trouble, and sometimes because actually some of them, and I think you use this phrase, Jim, they're sort of looking for father figures. And if that father figure is himself, and we are talking here about fathers, an infantry battalion, all men, if that father is himself broken, which was clearly the case sometimes, then the system breaks down. So it is important that the officer corps is maintained as placing a great deal of emphasis on integrity. Sometimes that may, in our society, mean that our serving officers, perhaps in the US as well as in Britain, can seem a bit old-fashioned, because they seem to have old-fashioned notions of service and what's right or wrong. Actually, maybe that's quite important, because you can't be too liberal on the battlefield in relation to your own soldiers. They must have a knowledge of what's right and what's wrong. Linked to that, I think, is also, and it's a more technical point, but I think it's important, is tours of duty. What Jim's book demonstrates, and what I've seen in my experience, is that 6 months in a battlefield, on the front line, and I'm not talking about myself here because I was a civilian, in certain circumstances can be physically extremely demanding. Now, we are talking about people of an average age of 22, 24, but despite that youth, physically very demanding, but more importantly, psychologically demanding. British tours have traditionally been 6 months. US tours have traditionally been much longer, and sometimes extended with no notice. Devastating effects on morale, devastating effects on psychology, and a loss of perspective. Officers, on the other hand, need longer, because they've got to set the example. We were profoundly ignorant about the situation in Iraq in 2003. It takes a long time to learn that. So actually you need a sort of double standards. You need officers, particularly senior officers, in theatre for longer, so they can have an appreciation of people, of who the good sheikhs are, who the bad sheikhs are. And the final point I want to make about military is that I am a great supporter of the Petraeus counterinsurgency notion, the importance of counterinsurgency as distinct from counterterrorism approach to military matters. There is a school of thought which says, these are bad guys, blow them away. The difficulty there, as John has been saying, this does not tally with this terrible consequences for body counts. I would put it, having had quite a lot of experience both in Jordan and South Asia, in Pashto, there's in Pashto Wali, the Afghan tribal code, there's a concept called badal, which is the obligation as a matter of honor to avenge a death. And what have we been doing? Unintentionally, we've been killing civilians. that leads to a whole lot of people who have an obligation. I may be misapplying Afghan rule to Iraqi tribal rule. I'm not sure I am actually all that much, because certainly the concept existed in my experience in Jordan. So one needs to bear that in mind. And counterinsurgency is starting to get unpopular again now because of the effects it has on US body count. A lot of US soldiers are complaining that the Petraeus doctrine is causing them casualties. But why are we there in the first place? Then, I'm rabbiting on, briefly on civilian. Suffice to say that the civilian support of the military in both theatres has been lamentable. The military are there to produce strategic space within which civilians can work to help reconstruct, to help a civilian government assume its responsibilities. The actual contribution of civilians has been dreadful. The root cause of this is the terrible concept of duty of care. Why is it, when we enter a war, and both these theatres were wars, that we, our politicians, are prepared to see soldiers, men and women, die, and are not prepared to take a risk of civilians dying? Is it because their permanent undersecretaries can be sued? If that's the case, then the terms and conditions of service of some civilians, not necessarily all, volunteers, like our soldiers, should be changed. And they haven't been changed since the Afghanistan operations started in October 2001.
So what we're looking at here is a lot of breakdowns in discipline that lead to the Black Hearts, breakdowns in the way that the military operates, a breakdown in the culture and the way that Iraqis see themselves post the invasion, and an increasing body count. So, just last week, Mr. Obama in his speech said, "I pledge to bring the war in Iraq to a responsible end." It is the forgotten war now, and basically as long as they feel that it's responsible, they can get out of there. Where are we in terms of where Iraq goes after the withdrawal? There are a couple of things which I'd like to lead into. One which is an obvious conflict between, I would think, John and Sir Hilary, is that Sir Hilary was one of the people who was actually in charge at the time, and John is basically saying that you guys didn't count the cost. Would you like to address that? I think John's already addressed that. Sir Hilary, do you have something to say about what John had pitched, basically?
Yeah. Well, I guess the accusation is valid. Certainly, for me and my civilian viewpoint, we didn't count the cost. We had no means of doing so. We were physically separate from the military. We were a tiny outfit, chronically small, and terribly curtailed by the time it came to 2004 by security protection. So no, we didn't count. But John hasn't gone so far as to suggest that those on the ground were not conscious of the cost. Maybe there's an implication that politicians, I hope there isn't an implication that we were not conscious of it or unconcerned about it. And indeed, the impression we tried, to some extent successfully in the west of southern Iraq, but completely failed to convince people in the east of southern Iraq, was that we were there as liberators rather than occupiers. We wanted to earn Iraqi consent to work with us to help them. We ultimately failed, dismally. But that was our intention. And I think the consciousness of the civilian cost was very much in our minds. Because I think, you know, the Petraeus counterinsurgency doctrine, for all the British failures about applying the Northern Ireland lessons, being too smug about Northern Ireland lessons, I think that counterinsurgency doctrine was in the minds of the British military. So the need to keep civilian deaths down was important. Partly, final point, Americans had equipment so that if things went wrong, they could take the attitude, well, we're going to blow this away. The British did not have equipment, so they spent an awful lot of time trying to prevent things going wrong. It's a different mindset.
Indeed. John?
Yes, I think I'd like to spend a little time just thinking about the future, because we can ruminate over the past for perhaps too long. I suppose one of the questions is, what would happen in Iraq if there isn't a proper accounting for the past? And we can draw parallels from other conflicts. The Bosnia War raged for 3-4 years in the early 90s, killed a very large number of Bosnian Serbs and of Bosnian Muslims. When the war finished, political demagogues started accusing the other side of killing very large numbers of their own. And we got this dueling of different, completely unsubstantiated estimates. So Serbs would say that huge numbers of Serbs were killed by the Muslims. Muslims would say, no, you killed more of our side. And this whole uncertainty about the situation was used to kind of stoke up political tensions, which might have led to conflict. What then happened was that civil society got a grip on this. They got some money from outside, and they did a massive door-to-door census of every single death in the Bosnian War. It took 3 years, several hundred researchers. They went to crematoria, they went to cemeteries, they went to government record offices, they went to newspapers, they knocked on doors, and at the end of the day they got a definitive record of 97,203 individuals, both civilian and military, Serbian, Muslim, who died in that war. And that number came about because each name was identified and put in an enormous database. And anybody could address that database and say, well, my brother isn't there. And they say, well, if you've got evidence, we'll add him. And the whole debate about numbers was just stopped because there was a transparent, individual-based list of the dead. My fear is if that list of the dead is not produced for Iraq, a similar process of political demagoguery and a mutual accusation between different factions will be used to stoke up future conflict. So this is not some technical nicety on the side. It would be rather nice to have a list of the dead, but actually we've got to get on with politics. Our claim would be, unless you have a list of the dead, politics will never work right.
Well, given that since the March 7th election, it's taken over 5.5 months for the Iraqi government not to be formed, are we in a situation where, with Muqtada al-Sadr effectively sidelined along with the Iranian-backed SCIRI, the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq, and on the one side, on the Shia side, apologize for falling into the Shia-Sunni faction thing, and on the Sunni side, you have the awakening councils who have not been fully integrated into the new Iraqi army or in any way into the governance of either at local level or at national level of the Iraq nation. Do you think, first of all, that we will ever get to a situation where there is a full reconciliation of the dead and who they were and how they came about?
I think there should be, a reconciliation among the living to start with, and this is not happening at the moment.
Why not?
The violence is continuous, and the occupation is continuous, and we keep talking like tonight and every time about the withdrawal of the US troops. Mm-hmm. In fact, when we look at it, there isn't real withdrawal of the US troops. We're talking about the combat, or what they describe as the combat. So we're having 50,000 soldiers remaining in Iraq. We have 94 US bases remaining in Iraq. 4 of them are the biggest in the Middle East. They will remain in Iraq, and also we have an increase in the mercenaries and the private contractors. The increase actually started with Obama in the office, so it's contrary to the whole issue about this.
So are you suggesting that if they did withdraw completely,
well,
that Iraq would actually manage to sort itself out?
That's it. Unless that will happen, and by the withdrawal we mean And this is not my really just idea, but when I pointed out to start with about the 13 factions of the resistance meeting, and their statement, the final statement was, there will be no peace conceivable in Iraq unless there will be a complete withdrawal, and the withdrawal means combat, non-combat, mercenaries, contractors, advisors, consultants, under any label you will like them. When you have all these troops there, there is no peace.
Okay.
They will be there.
So, if they were to remove all these combatants and contractors, etc., what would they leave behind in Iraq? Because at the moment, the Iraqi government is not in control of its own country. There are 700,000 people in the Iraqi security forces, but at this stage, the government can't even supply basic electricity, sewage services, etc., etc. So if those people were to withdraw, there would be no further reconstruction, which is still ongoing, even albeit at a very much reduced pace. Would Iraq be able to stand up on its own 2 feet, or would it fall foul of the internecine fighting between the Sunnis, possibly backed by Saudi Arabia, and the Shia, backed by the Iranians?
Maybe we should examine, to start with, is what the American troops exactly doing in Iraq. Are they the peace forces exactly, or what, or their presence itself is a cause for all this violence? That's one side. And the second aspect is there construction really? What about all the money disappearing in their billions? I mean, every 6 to 1 year, we hear about the committee in front of the Congress talking about 9 billions disappearing. How? How that money disappeared? It's not disappeared by only Iraqis corrupted. So they are corrupted. Those are, remember, those are the Iraqis being brought by the Americans and the British. They've been handpicked. They did not pick me. They picked those people. So here they are with this dilemma, and we are left, Iraqis, to deal with all these problems, telling us how we deal with it, how to do with it, while the thing should be the perspective to look from the other side, how the Americans, how the British are going to deal with it in order to secure their security. Because this is the danger created there by their own hands. With the lack of planning, I don't believe that. I mean, they have the best think tanks. We're only Bedouins there. We don't know about anything.
So, Jim.
Yes?
You're the American. If they were to withdraw the Americans, what do we think would happen in Iraq? What do you see from your? I mean, you've taken a very microcosmic look at how America operated in a very specific instance. But I'm asking you to step back from that and take a much more broad look at the thing. There was a breakdown. The breakdown was at platoon level, but also it was a breakdown right at the top, where they didn't actually get their act together immediately after the invasion. There was no plan, and it didn't work. We now have this face-off between two power blocks. We have the US maintaining 50,000 non-combat troops, training and assist, and we have Iran with its influence, and possibly Saudi Arabia backing up some of the Sunnis who are in a minority.
Right. I mean, finer minds than mine have predicted what's going to happen in Iraq and have been utterly, utterly wrong. So I don't have a crystal ball, and I couldn't possibly predict what's going to happen with this non-existent coalition government and what could happen in terms of power vacuums that open up, and whether Saudi Arabia rushes into the vacuum or Iran does. I mean, I don't know the degree to which 50,000 troops remaining on Iraqi soil is the thing that is preventing Alawi and Maliki over the past 5 months from creating a government. I don't know that to be true. If that's, I find it hard to believe. But if that's the case, I mean, I'm not the policy expert in terms of that. I think that there's also problems with the Iraqi parties as currently set up, and the elections, the way they're run, and coalitions that are incapable of forming. Obviously, the talks just broke down yesterday or the day before. So the link between 50,000 US troops on the ground and the Iraqi parliament being unable to form, I'm not sure where the connection is.
I think we're at a stage when we can open the questions, the panel to the questions on the floor. If anybody would like to ask a question, please keep it brief, and I would beg you not to turn it into a diatribe followed by a very short question at the end. I'd rather you had a longer question and no diatribe. So if, gentleman at the front here, if you could just hold on a second.
Ali Al-Bazaz, thank you very much for doing the Iraq body count. I just wanted to ask you about the John Hopkins study at the Lancet and also the Orb study, and they came with significantly higher numbers. What do you think about the discrepancy, and how valid are those two?
Okay,
they were closer to 1 million, 2007.
There's a big discussion taking place in the community of people who do surveys about whether surveys can be validly done in conflict situations. The survey methodologies that we have at our disposal were designed actually by medics to look at the spread of disease in populations, which spreads in a fairly orderly way through a population. Violence isn't like that. You can have one village which is completely wiped out by bombs. You go 5 miles down the road and no one has died at all. And therefore, the sampling assumptions which underlie surveys are very, very tricky indeed. And there are multiple sources of error in any survey. And this comes to the result that when you even survey the same period of time in the same country, you get radically different results. Now, everyone, or a lot of people, know about the John Hopkins Lancet survey because it had a great deal of publicity. Fewer people know that 2 years later, another survey was published called the Iraq Family Health Survey, which was a much bigger study with many, many more sampling points, a much more rigorous methodology. And they came up with 155,000 for exactly the same period of time. So you have two surveys, one saying 155,000, another one saying more than 600,000. Which do you believe? Well, our position would be you can't believe either of them. What you actually have to do is the much harder work of, rather than taking a snapshot survey at one point in time, which takes you up to June 2006 and no further, you have to do what the Bosnians did. You have to knock on every door. You have to get the list. And so what Iraq Body Count is trying to do is something very unsatisfactory and saying, okay, we can't do the door-to-door stuff now. Let's grab everything we can. Let's grab every newspaper report. Let's grab every government missive and put it all together. So at least when the process of going and knocking on every door can take place, you've got a starting point.
The gentleman behind.
Hello, I just want to ask whether truth and reconciliation is possible with a continuing army of occupation.
Hilary. Truth and reconciliation between Iraqis?
I was thinking of the South African model and whether that's possible in Iraq.
Do you mean between Iraqis? Or
yes, between Iraqis,
right,
yes.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, it may not be. And, you know, the fundamental point about with Iraq, I think it may well be true that no real peace will be possible as long as combat troops are present, because they are undoubtedly a magnet for violence. The difficulty, of course, is that it's not known what would happen if they were withdrawn. It may be the case that peace is not possible so long as they're there. It doesn't at all follow from that peace will come once they leave. I suspect that when you consider the India-Pakistan situation, there's been absolutely no peace and reconciliation at the broad level 63 years after partition/independence. So I would have thought this is a generational thing. It's not actually that, it's quite possible that some individuals could never be reconciled, but a new generation may put it into a different perspective and be looking more forward than back. But at present, the pictures, the recent pictures, are so horrible and so violent and so painful that you can't expect people to forget them. You're not necessarily suggesting that with reconciliation, but I would say that it's going to take an awful long time. And if you add to that the Sunni-Shia differences, then it's a very long time. And I don't think it's just dependent on the withdrawal of combat troops or the withdrawal of foreign troops.
Could I bring Haifa in there?
Can I just say, I mean, in case of South Africa, it's happened after the end of apartheid rule, and it took a few years after. So in Iraq now, it is in war. There is war going on. So this is not going to happen. Let's finish the war, get the troops out, and people will find a way of talking to each other. Actually, they're talking to each other now. I mean, it's people trying their best within the terrible circumstances, and I can give you examples and for hours and hours, but in that format, the way you spoke about publicly, I don't think that's possible or feasible in state of war.
Can I just revisit a little bit in the light of what you've just said, what you said earlier about the withdrawal of the troops, because the question said if the troops were withdrawn, and in that we include contractors and people like that.
Yeah.
What do you think would happen in Iraq if they were withdrawn? Do you think, because you say we're in a state of war at the moment,
yes,
would that war carry on? Or is that war focused on them? Are they the cause of the war?
No, I think it might continue for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
who were the participants in that?
I mean, the occupation just nurtured a class of people who are really getting quite beneficial of what's going on. And if they are left for many years to come inside, I mean, there will be even having their roots there. And this is quite worrying. But if we manage to get rid of the whole thing as soon as possible, so I think there will be only some people will leave the country anyway. It's like in Vietnam when they escaped with the American troops and all this stuff. And actually some people are leaving already. I know of people who are within the government and things, they started leaving. So in that case, I think, I mean, the resistance, the factions, the groups, all, they are going to have a national government for 6 months. This is the idea. I mean, the program is there. And then we have an election, and we'll see what will happen. That does not mean it's going to work smoothly as it should be, but that's the way forward, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Another question. Gentleman with glasses.
Frank Jackson, World Disarmament Campaign. I'd love to actually involve in the debate rather than just ask a question, but obviously you're not going to let me do that, except just to say, right, that I was totally opposed to the war from the very beginning, and a recognition of that, I think, has to be a starting point for any long-term future for Iraq, that it was totally legal and wrong. However, two quick questions, if I may. How do we, in terms of wanting to get the American soldiers out altogether, how do we influence their geopolitical aims, which is the reason they are there? And secondly, on the question of reconciliation, is there any sort of outside body, representatives of the Arab League, for example, who might be brought in to help the question of reconciliation once we have got the situation, as Haifa says, where it might be possible to pursue it?
Right. Who would like to speak to the influence of the geopolitical aims?
I think we should hear a view as to whether the Americans are influenceable by outside power.
Well, that's my worry, actually.
Well, I mean, maybe that's an American voice.
What do you think, John? I'm sorry, you are the nominal American.
I am a journalist. I am not a policy thinker, avowedly so, and purposely so. And I'm, by definition, occupationally, I am reactive, not proactive. I think people do things, and I react to them. So as to that question, I'm not trying to duck it, but I'm going to duck it. How influence, to a degree. To a degree. Influenceable to a degree.
Right. Okay. The one thing that wasn't actually said is what the gentleman thought the geopolitical aims were, which I presume you would.
Well, it would take rather a longer time than just. You're not going to let me do that.
Indeed. Possibly.
Oil is certainly a factor.
Well, is oil a factor? Okay. Does anybody here think that oil has actually been exploited significantly in that we have not actually sorted out the oil law? We don't know where the revenues are going to go. There is still a fight on between the central government and the Kurdish government as to who owns Kirkuk and the oil fields around there. So, you know, as to the Americans having gone in for the strategic reason of oil, I think is at this stage rather mute, and they would rather be moving themselves out of there. There might have been at some stage, and that is open to discussion and dispute, some kind of intention of going in for the oil, but I think that really got very quickly lost in 2003. I would bring Sir Hilary in here, and possibly, I mean, you must have been involved in discussions that were beyond the Official Secrets Act that might have addressed this at some stage. Did you ever get any inkling that this was a geostrategic aim?
No, the narrative was absolutely that it wasn't. And happily, down in the south, although one of the two major oil fields were in the south, it was made abundantly clear to the British that the whole issue of oil was an American area. I think that the production of oil has barely risen since 2003. Revenues have increased as oil prices have spiked. But I mean, it has been a tragedy that for Iraq, that they haven't got more benefit out of it. As you say, there's a real squabble between the Kurds and the central Iraqi authorities about the division of spoils, if you like. The other point about oil, and I don't think your question was actually about oil, but there we are, is that, I mean, this is one of the factors which will make post-American withdrawal governance so difficult, because the potential spoils are enormous. So it's not just that the politicians are concerned for their lives if they cease to be important politicians with forces behind them, but actually these revenues are very nice, thank you very much. I was so busy trying to avoid the first question that I'd forgotten the second question.
Well, the second one I think I'll put to John, whether there's any body that one could go to bring in justification and reconciliation, given that what you think is the basis for all that is going to be the list.
Well, certainly the regional perspective must be hugely important, and the involvement of regional partners, regional neighbours in some kind of eventual reconciliation, it's much more plausible that they will be able to exert some influence over matters than people from far away. But I do want to return to the first question. If not oil, what? Now, the people whose thinking I respect, so I'm just simply mouthing other people's views here, is that Iran was always the ultimate prize. And several people from the administration and close to the administration have gone on record as saying Iraq was en route to controlling and containing Iran. And if you look at the positioning of American forces in that region, I mean, Iran is completely encircled. And I think that could be probably a much more significant long-term driver of American presence in Iraq than the failed oil project.
Excellent, thank you. Lady at the back in the blue. I don't know who she is.
Lindsay Hilton, Channel. Jim, it's a question for you about the book. Particularly heinous incidents obviously has echoes of My Lai and Vietnam and so on. Do you feel that the American military have learnt anything from this? Is anything going to change, or do you think it's inevitable that from time to time with military adventures like this that you are going to get this kind of war crime?
Well, I think that war crimes have been an inevitable byproduct of war since war has existed, first and foremost. Secondly, I think that rules, regulations, policies, and troop leading procedures were in place to prevent this sort of thing from happening. I mean, in the very detailed timeline of events, you know, a group of soldiers who were no more than 24 years old, 6 of them were left marooned at a pretty remote outpost for about 12 days straight. Leaving aside of the 5 months that had come before, various troop leading failures that had happened, I mean, that's just not supposed to happen. Specialists should not be left without any oversight from platoon sergeants, platoon leaders, or more senior officers. So that right there is not supposed to happen. And so that was a not a failure of policy in the macro. The policy was there to prevent it, and so this was an individual failing that a new policy couldn't correct. It was just adherence to the old. On top of that, I mean, I've been very gratified and honored and grateful that the U.S. Army military intellectual and theoretical leadership, think tanks, and superstructure have embraced Black Hearts to a degree that I actually never thought that they would. I mean, not only has the book not been attacked by the military, it's been embraced, and it's being taught, it's being used as a kind of case study to workshop role-playing and junior officers to put themselves in the shoes of certain officers who are in the book of what would I do, how would you react to an untenable situation. I mean, some of the, just to myself, I would think of some of the officers who were put into this unit. One of them in particular said to me, how do you fix an unfixable situation? And that's a really good question, and it's on an individual junior officer level, it's a good role-playing role-playing scenario exercise to engage in. And on top of that, I think that if places like West Point and Fort Leavenworth and Command and General Staff College are actually taking some of the finer, just personality-driven and bureaucratic and almost office politics issues that play out in Black Hearts, I think that if it has any impact on a junior soldier, then the book has been successful beyond anything I hoped for.
I'm afraid we've got time for just one more question. So, who's it going to be? Gentleman in the middle. Sorry, thanks.
James Perry from the London School of Economics. I'm interested to know what, if anything, we've learned from the Chilcot inquiry. I know it's not finished yet, but from the evidence that's been received thus far, what, if anything, can we learn from that?
Okay, well, I think that the Chilcot inquiry has been addressed by John before. Can I have your view on it in a short soundbite, and then we'll go on to Sir Hilary. Are you across the Chilcot inquiry?
I'm familiar with it, but I really couldn't speak to it in an authoritative way.
Well, I've been following it for some time now, and I think it's useful for the British people. The Iraqi voice absolutely absent there, as if the war being conducted in vacuum against the British people themselves. So it's like talking heads, I thought they were. Is it a play by Ellen Bennett? That's how I feel about it.
Okay.
Well, as one who's given evidence to the Chilcot inquiry, and I was very glad to do so, I really hope the lessons are learnt. I sat down beside the general who was in charge of military forces at the time I was there, and although we had completely different responsibilities, I was struck by the fact that without any connivance or pre-preparation, we were actually echoing, perhaps in slightly different language, what we were each saying. I hope too that it won't fall into the trap of being seen as a whitewash. The public perception of the Hutton inquiry was that it was a whitewash. The Butler inquiry was so carefully worded that it could be used by those who sought to use it as suggesting that there was really little blame. Though if you read between the lines as a seasoned bureaucrat, you could see there was a lot of blame actually being handed around. I do hope the Chilcot inquiry is not perceived like that, because, as I said at the beginning, I think it's absolutely essential that lessons are learnt and put into practice. So we'll have to wait and see. I think it's the turn of the year, as they expect. And I'm glad to see that at last they are actually going to Iraq for the first time, I think. That's something. But you're right, Haifa, that a conspicuous absence of evidence from Iraqis.
On which note, I'm going to bring this discussion to a close. Thank you very much for coming to listen to the panelists, and thank you to all the panelists, to Jim for talking about your book and giving us such an extraordinary insight into once again, an extraordinary event that happened. Thank you to John for explaining what the body count means and what is necessary in order for reconciliation to take place. To Haifa for giving us the Iraqi woman's perspective on things, but also for representing the Iraqi voice, which, as is so often the case in discussions that happen about this particular war in this part of the world, we don't have enough Iraqi voices actually in it, as we've just discussed in the Chilcot inquiry, etc. And to Sir Hilary for coming along as one of the participants in the conflict, albeit in a civilian role, but somebody who has a conscience and has had responsibility and has exercised that and is now exercising his conscience. Thank you very much for coming along, and good night.